the serialized version was expanded, reworked, and submitted to more than 20 publishers. Can you predict it?
0.
Each of whom rejected it. One editor prophetically wrote, quote, "I might be making the mistake of the decade, but... ...
Love it.
Welcome, friends, to episode 201 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss the first part of Frank Herbert's 1965 sci-fi novel, Dune. Fear is the mind killer, James. I finally know what that quote is from.
Right.
What an awesome line that was. And what a cool book. We have read exactly not exactly 1/3, but the book is divided into 3 parts, book 1, book 2, book 3. We thought that would be a good way to tackle this. So we have read book 1 within the book of Dune.
Yeah. I'm just like brimming with things to talk about, but you said the line, fear is the mind killer. So I do want to give a massive shout out to my physical copy. Is so cool. When you take the sleeve off, the hardcover, it's like embossed. Fear is the mind killer is like embossed on the front cover. So it's like this hidden message.
That's cool. Which one do you have? Do you have that one? Do you have the same one I have? Here's mine.
Here, I'll show you.
You have a hardcover.
I have a hardcover.
Oh, okay. I have the paperback, which I freaking love. Oh my god, I love that one too. Yeah, with the big blue kind of.
Yeah.
The covers for this book are so fucking good, man. I love that. Like all the art I've seen, they're coming out with a tie-in edition, which is the one I'm not a big fan of. Because I mean, these are so gorgeous, and you're in the tie-in editions in general for books. Not usually.
I'm so low on them. Like I don't know if that's I'm the movie guy, but like I so much prefer the original covers or like a newer. I don't mind the edition, anything like that, as they change. But as soon as you throw the movie poster with like now a major motion picture, I'd find that less interesting.
Yeah, give me the custom art and cover any day.
By the way, check out these pages.
It's so good. It's like a blue on the.
It's the eyes,
edge,
the eye
edge.
color. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a cool book, man. I am very jealous of that. I want one now. I'm going to read this quote real quick just because I think it's worth giving it in full. It is, "I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. When it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain," which is a Bene Gesserit, I think, litany. It's called like the Litany Against Fear. Mm-hmm. Really interesting quote. Like, what's your take on that quote?
I mean, I think it's going to continue to have more meaning, but clearly it's like almost a religion, right? It's like this faith-based thing.
It's almost psychology to me too, though, here. It's like how to handle intense fear. Like, what do you do with it rather than let it sort of paralyze you?
And I think we see many people in the book so far even that like are paralyzed by the moment. And then there are those who like kind of rise above that. But even like more physically, like these people seem to have powers through this religion. And like I think like the like fearless within this religion you can kind of see that they are like, specifically speaking about Paul, like as time goes on, we're starting to see him like sort of have less fear, become more logical at times, and like his mind is becoming more powerful.
Lots of cool characters here, which we're going to get into. But yeah, I mean, basically we're going to divide it up this way. We're going to give some general thoughts here at the start, spoiler free. Then we will talk about some of the origins of the novel I read about, some of the behind the scenes kind of writing details, stuff about Frank Herbert. And then we will get into the plot itself. I have it divided into 2 chunks, and we will be doing full spoilers for the first book of the entire novel. Now, we haven't read the whole book, so we can't really spoil anything beyond that. I guess we should go ahead and talk about what our experiences with Dune as a franchise and as a, because that old movie exists. Have you seen the old movie? What do you remember of it?
Yeah, I have seen the old movie and I can remember almost nothing because I think that I saw this movie around the time. So I can't remember if it was like VHS days or what, but I remember I did have VHS copies of Star Wars that I watched like endlessly. And around that time, I remember seeing a lot of other sci-fi films. I think I saw this at a friend's house for the first time, and I remember not really getting sucked into it. I remember just it kind of bounced off me. And I thought, in hindsight, I think I liked some of the stuff, but I haven't really touched the material since then. But a few years back, they remade, I guess, there was this Dune board game that they had made a long time ago, and they reprinted it recently. And so I purchased that around the time that you were coming to visit. And so we played that, and like I vaguely remembered some of the sort of like factions of people and that sort of thing, and the game was a lot of fun. But while I was doing my reading this week, I busted the board game out and started going through and I understood everything, and I
Were you
felt
looking
like,
at the characters?
yeah, characters
Yeah.
and sort of what their factions' powers were, and
Yeah.
like what sort of advantages they get and stuff.
If you don't know, the game is sort of an asymmetrical warfare game that has like a moving storm mechanic, and there can be sandworms, and you represent different factions battling for control of Arrakis. It's a very cool game. I like it. I played it a couple other times. My buddy Monty has a copy as well up here in Oregon, so I've played at his house. It's a fun game, and reading this book makes me want to play it again for sure.
Yeah. Well, and it gives like I liked the game outside of the lore, but getting more of the lore and I was looking at the map and sort of pointing out areas that they'd been to in the story so far, and it's just a lot of fun.
Very cool. And that'll probably even get even deeper as we go. There is also another adaptation of this. It's the Sci-Fi Channel original miniseries
I have not seen that.
called Dune. Yeah, my parents watched it.
Nice.
I remember vividly them watching it, and I came out and I saw parts of it, but I was a teen at the time. It came out in the year 2000, so yeah, I was literally probably like 14 or so when that came out, and it was like, yeah, I didn't want to be like, I don't know, it just didn't pull me in, and at the time I remember walking by and catching it, but it's also around the time where Sci-Fi Channel was doing kind of a lot of B, maybe C, tier adaptations and shows. So I didn't take it seriously. And like you, I had seen the older version when I was very young, and I think it is not. I want to watch it again, which we're going to do on Patreon. We're going to watch that as a bonus episode. We'll release that probably this month. The plan is to do around the time of the new movie. We're going to watch that old movie again. And my suspicion is it is a movie that is just not suited for a child, which it sounds like both of us were when we watched it. It was too complex, weird, dark. And I know that the movie is considered kind of it's a David Lynch film. Like it's
Right.
kind of a
Which
weird
I'm excited
one anyway.
That's really why I want to jump back into it, is because like I love David Lynch films. I find them endlessly fascinating, and to get to dive into what he did for a Dune film is going to be amazing. But also, I watched this documentary years and years ago, which I'm going to revisit after we finish the book. I don't think we'll have any sort of coverage. Maybe I'll talk about it in passing, but it's called Jidoworski's Dune. And basically, he is like this filmmaker that had this great reputation at the time. And like, he's got a lot of like experimental, weird films, and had a lot of really interesting takes, and a lot of the materials. He had like sketches done, and he had all these things that were done to prep for the film, and he was going to create it. And it became this like legend around Dune, I believe.
Yeah. So, friend of the podcast, Remy Nakamura, I was over at his place a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about Dune. And he mentioned Jidoworski's Dune, and apparently how one of the legends surrounding this like sketchbook, because I guess he was like kind of an artist too. And so there's all this.
He was like a comic book
stuff.
artist. He's done literally everything under the umbrella of art.
So there's all this like sci-fi concept stuff, right, in this movie that never ended up getting made. Its budget was ballooning, and it just didn't end up happening. This was in the 70s. But apparently this sketchbook in Jidoworski's Dune, if I'm saying that name correctly, is incredibly influential, or it is sort of rumored to be incredibly influential for films like Blade Runner and Alien.
That's why I'm familiar with it.
Like Ridley Scott apparently was greatly influenced by it, which those became incredibly influential films for like the look of sci-fi in Western films, right? So thinking back, that this could all tie back to this potential adaptation that never got made. That stuff I'll definitely be curious to look more into as we're just kind of getting started with Dune. We're going to be doing this for a month, so I'm not trying to get into everything that can possibly get into. We're focusing mostly on the book here, and I have a lot to talk about for why this book is so important. But before we do, what are your initial impressions of reading Dune? What does it remind you of? Does it remind you of anything else you've read? How does it stack up to? Because I know this is a project we've been thinking about covering for a long time.
Yeah.
How does it stack up now that you're actually reading it?
It's a novel and a story that like I am so drawn to, and I've like immediately been hooked. And I know that there is like, I've heard people talk about how it's tough to get into with all the crazy names and the locations, and it dumps a lot on you. But like, I think I felt a little bit of that right away, and it almost immediately went away.
Yeah.
And I started really getting sucked in.
We've been training for that with all our epic fantasy we read, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so I got sucked in, and I'm so enjoying the story. I'm having a great time, and I think that I'm also able to put it in context of like when it was made, what it influenced, and everything like that, and appreciate it in that sense because, of course, it's similar to things like Star Wars, and it feels similar to. Like John Carter. I was getting some John Carter vibes, of course, because like Princess of Mars is probably influential towards this or something.
Yeah,
and
I think that's safe to say, yeah.
And those were standing out a lot to me. But then even like the political concepts and things that are going on reminds me of like the type of story of something like Game of Thrones, where it's like very much about the vying for power in an area, and it's not just necessarily like running around in the dunes from sandworms.
Right. And I think George R.R. Martin would say, well, I was inspired by the real world War of the Roses and the houses and all this stuff. But I totally agree. I think there's some inspiration coming from Dune in Game of Thrones. It just was giving me those vibes. It's such a monumental piece of fiction in the genre. It's considered the most popular sci-fi novel of all time. I don't know if you know that.
I can see it. I genuinely feel like it's living up to the hype so far. Like I'm really, really drawn in. The world's incredible. It's really well detailed, very interesting. It's written in 1965, so there's moments of like sort of when you read a sci-fi story that's older like that, or that's not that old relatively, but when you read a story like that, there'll be things where it's like, oh yeah, and then they had coffee, and then they did something like normal next to the fact that like, and then they got on this crazy flying vessel and did all of these like sci-fi things. So it's funny to see some of that, but ultimately it's all really holding up for me so far.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually have been pretty impressed with how well it holds up and how a lot of the tech, because there is a really fascinating intersection between what I would classify as hard sci-fi and soft sci-fi. This novel is sort of famous for being soft sci-fi, but it's not completely. And there's a lot of hard sci-fi concepts. It's an ecological novel. It's a lot about the ecology of this desert planet, and a lot of the science behind that feels very hard to me. It feels well researched and grounded. And then you take that and you start introducing like visions and religion and almost magic at times. And it becomes very space opera reminiscent of something like Star Wars, which came after. So, the other way around, this probably was influential for something like Star Wars. And then all of that also comes back to it is tonally more similar to something like a Game of Thrones. Like this feels very dark and serious, and it's very backstabbing and violent at times, and very intricate, right? And all of that feels very grand.
Yeah, I guess we should be saying A Song of Ice and Fire, by the way, right? We're kind of being bad book fans right now.
Yeah,
A Song
true.
of Ice and Fire.
Yeah. Forget about the show. We're talking about the books.
I did want to ask you actually about like this sort of ecological look at this planet too, because it feels like there's a statement being made here that we haven't seen the full realization of yet.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if, Herbert's trying to comment on the way that humans can interact with a planet and change it for the better or for the worse. And like, obviously the spice is very important. Is sort of this resource.
Absolutely is the answer to that. Not only is the spice He's even said at later points in time, it's sort of a metaphor for oil in the Middle East. It's also just kind of a metaphor for scarce resources and people fighting over them, right?
Well, I couldn't get over how awesome the detail is to have this addictive, powerful thing that they put in their foods and they consume, and how it's able to do that, as well as also seemingly give people like knowledge to understand things they otherwise couldn't have. And like to have that dual purpose of it being like something that people are addicted to, but also something that is like almost necessary to advance society further on.
And it's intricately tied to the land, which is tied to the religion of the Fremen, which is that's all very fascinating. And we haven't even seen like the full exploration of this yet, right? Obviously, but you can see what he's kind of getting at right here with like imperialism, and it's fascinating. I'm curious to see what the messages are as we explore this more and more. But one of the fascinating things is how feudal this all is, right? Literally, we have like fiefdoms, and you have a duke and an emperor and a baron, and that's the stuff that kind of reminds me of Game of Thrones. So it's this fascinating intersection of something that's in the far future where humanity is capable of interstellar travel, and then you mix it with this very old throwback style of government, which creates kind of an epic fantasy feel in the midst of all of this. Like I felt very at home with the concept of a, boy born to royalty who is maybe a prophesied hero and maybe has supreme powers because he's got this like, he's like a mentat. Bene Gesserit, but he's also like the first boy Bene Gesserit who's able to do this sort of stuff, and like so he's all this like special stuff wrapped into one. He's very prototypical in that way for what would be in a fantasy novel, yet you're seeing it in a mix of hard and soft sci-fi, and you're clearly setting up a massive epic story. And we could talk about all the ways in which he does that is, I think, clever. And because of that, like I can see the appeal of this book. I am finding it really engaging. And for a book that was written in 1965, it is reading fantastically well to me. I'm loving it. I do want to give a shout out to the audiobook. I have a physical copy, which I have been reading off and on, but the audiobook version of this that I have at least is spectacular. Has voice actors. There's different people for different roles who come in and just do the dialogue.
And honestly, that can bother me sometimes, but it's really well done in this version.
It's really well done, and there's also like a little bit of ambient music and sound and stuff. It's almost like an adaptation in and of itself, but I was following along to make sure, because I was like, I wonder if they're cutting a lot out. And I was following along, and it's word for word from everything I saw. So it's, it's the book. It's just being performed in a way that is, I think, really next level. And with the one slight criticism I would have, that at one point the Duke, for whatever reason, the guy who like does the voice of the Duke was just gone for like an entire chunk of the story where the Duke was doing important stuff, and it was just the narrator doing like a Duke voice, which was fine. But I had gotten I was struck by how great the Duke's voice was, like the guy who was performing the role, that his absence was really glaring, and it made me wonder, like, what happened? Why wasn't he there that day? Like, why wasn't he for this part? Very odd.
Actually reminds me, like, I went and watched the trailer again after I finished this section,
because you know who some of the characters are now.
Yeah, and I really like thought it was awesome. I found it, obviously I kind of can see what's going on in some. I think they didn't give much away, honestly, beyond what we've read here, and I thought that was really cool to see all the characters that they've chosen, and it's exciting.
Absolutely. Anyway, shout out to the audiobook. It is very good. So yeah, my general thoughts on this, just like, I'm really into it. I'm enjoying it. Excited to get to the middle and end chunk of it. I can see why this is so well regarded. I, just as a brief aside, am writing a sci-fi novel myself that is a blend of hard and soft sci-fi. So I just think this is a very good book for me to be reading right now, as I'm still kind of finalizing my novel, because he's doing it masterfully, and the way he blends those two together, I think, is brilliant. And so there's a lot of great lessons to be learned here. And so just as a student of writing, I'm excited to continue to read this.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that the way that the hard sci-fi can sort of ground the whole story and make it feel so real, like we're
Right.
there, and yeah, it's just so much fun.
Very cool. Okay, so if you're ready, I think let's talk about Frank Herbert the person, and then we can move into the plot.
Yeah, let's do it.
So Franklin Patrick Herbert Jr. was born in 1920 and died in 1986 at the age of 65. He was an American science fiction author best known for his 1965 novel Dune and its 5 sequels. Though he became famous for his novels, he also wrote short stories and worked as a newspaper journalist, photographer, book reviewer, ecological consultant, and lecturer. So I read through a good bit of his life story. Basically, he grew up in the Pacific Northwest. I think he was born in Tacoma. He ended up joining, I think it was the Navy, where he was a photographer during World War II for a little bit. I think just for a year. And then he came back and he was living in Oregon. He became a writer for a newspaper in Portland, Oregon. He would publish a novel called The Dragon in the Sea in 1957, which was actually pretty well regarded. And it talked about, I was reading about it, it talked about these submarines. It was kind of a psychological thriller with a blend of sci-fi. These submarines went to the Middle East, I guess, and were like getting oil and bringing it back. And he described them as dragging bags of oil behind the submarines. And apparently a real world invention was made after this book came out, where they were like, that's a good idea. And they like tried it. So I don't know how successful it was. I didn't get a chance to like fully research it, but that's the kind of thing that's cool. It's like if you're coming up with an idea and people who like know what they're doing are like, that's kind of a good idea. Let's try that. That's pretty cool, right?
I mean, I feel like we see that in sci-fi sometimes too, right? I feel like a lot of Philip K. Dick stuff has kind of been eventually created.
Well, and you look at like how many inventions people have come up with because they basically want to make some Star Trek thing they saw real.
Right.
Yeah, sci-fi, that's one of the really cool things about sci-fi that is like a massive topic, but it's something that is very fun, and we're seeing it here, right? So then in 1957, he's working in this at this newspaper. He gets hired to travel to Florence, Oregon, to study the Oregon dunes. While he was there, the Department of Agriculture was attempting to use something called poverty grasses to stabilize the sand dunes, because the sand dunes were moving around in the wind and were threatening the environment in the area. So Herbert claimed in a letter to his literary agent that the moving dunes could, quote, swallow cities whole, lakes, rivers, and highways. Herbert's article on the dunes was called, quote, They Stopped the Moving Sands, but was never completed, and only published decades later in a book called The Road to Dune. But its research sparked Herbert's interest in ecology and deserts. So this is that sorry seed we like to talk about so much. He was inspired by these Oregon dunes, and I was looking them up, and I'm like, where are these things? They are a little further south on the Oregon coast than I have been yet. I've been, I think as south as like Newport, if I'm remembering correctly the name of the town I went to. Maybe a little bit more south than that, but this is like another 30, 45 minutes south of that, I think, from what I was seeing, maybe an hour. So it's cool because I would love to go to it. It might be a bit far from Portland, but very fun. It's cool that it's like a real place and that it was sort of inspired in Oregon. I had no idea of this. This is a fun behind the scenes stuff.
I love that. That's cool. I actually I've been to a few like national parks and areas that had like massive dunes. Like I've been to White Sands, that's in New Mexico. It's a national park. Being there is like wild. When you get in the dunes, they make you feel very small, and I just like, you think about being trapped out in an area like that with looming like threats and
start imagining sandworms underneath your feet.
We might have to make a pilgrimage out to the dunes like we did to the Overlook Hotel.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, next time you come visit, maybe we'll head out to the dunes. I'm going to be visiting Florida though sooner than that, which we can talk about later. But so beside just the inspiration of the dunes, he was also really interested in the idea of superhero mystique and messiahs. He believed that feudalism was a natural condition that humans fell into, where some led and others gave up responsibility of making decisions and just followed orders. He found that desert environments have historically given birth to several major religions with messianic impulses. He decided to join his interests together so he could play religious and ecological ideas against each other. In addition, he was influenced by the story of T.E. Lawrence and the messianic overtones in Lawrence's involvement in the Arab Revolt, which, by the way, is the inspiration for Lawrence of Arabia.
I was about to ask that, yeah.
In an early version of Dune, the hero was actually very similar to Lawrence of Arabia, but Herbert decided that the plot was too straightforward and added more layers to the story. Another significant source of inspiration for Dune was Herbert's experiences with psilocybin and his hobby of cultivating mushrooms. So this is also the 60s. We talked about with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? And experiments with psilocybin. So yeah, that's really fascinating. So you get all this coming together of multiple things, right? Like obviously study of history, thinking about ecological impacts of things, thinking about the dunes, and then I guess the psilocybin maybe that's one of the inspirations for the way that the spice opens your mind and makes you see things and connections that you don't otherwise see. So like I can see how maybe that led into that, right?
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, so that's really fascinating. He would spend the next 5 years researching, writing, and revising. He then published a 3-part serial called Dune World in Analog magazine from December 1963 to February 1964. The serial was accompanied by several illustrations that were not published again, which is interesting. I wonder if they're rare these days. After an interval of a year, he published the much slower-paced 5-part The Prophet of Dune in the January to May 1965 issues. The first serial became Book 1, Dune, in the final published Dune novel, and the second serial was divided into Book 2, Moad'Dib, and Book 3, The Prophet. So what we just read was eventually made into Book 1 of the book we just read, right? Like that is the original serial that ran in Analog, what we just read.
Yeah.
Now it was changed a little bit when it became a novel, but similar, right? At least. The serialized version was expanded, reworked, and submitted to more than 20 publishers. Can you predict it?
0.
Each of whom rejected it. One editor prophetically wrote, quote, "I might be making the mistake of the decade, but... ...
Love it.
Dune was finally accepted and published in 1965 by Chilton Books, a printing house better known for publishing auto repair manuals.
Wow.
I just think that's pretty
fun. That's so crazy. I think I had heard that somewhere.
Yeah, right. That's pretty amazing, right? The book itself was not an immediate commercial success. It was critically loved. It was nominated for some awards. And then he would go on to publish more novels later, start building his brand. It was sort of people liked it, but it wasn't a massive audience at first. But it wasn't really until the 1980s adaptation came out before it really took off and became much more popular. He would die in 1986, only 2 years after that movie came out. So he saw like true fame for this series only towards the end of his life. He died from a pulmonary embolism after getting treatment for cancer. Tragically pretty young, honestly.
Yeah.
And really just as he was starting to see major success for this. His son would go on to co-author several additional Dune novels in its series because there was a lot of apparently open threads that he hadn't quite wrapped up. And so he went on to co-author this with author Kevin J. Anderson, which was using notes left behind by Frank Herbert and discovered a decade after his death or so. Additional books have continued to come out in recent years. They wrote 3 prequel trilogies, Prelude to Dune, Legends of Dune, and The Great Schools of Dune, exploring the history of Dune universe in the original novel. So there's just tons of this like extended universe Dune stuff out there that if you really want to dig into, you can get well lost in. It sounds like it's an amazing series, and it's been considered the epic example of literary world building in science fiction. Has been favorably compared to Lord of the Rings as sort of the Lord of the Rings of sci-fi.
So, it didn't have a success early, like massive success early. Yeah. And then after the film, is that when people started like sort of revisiting and realizing, because it's kind of known as the example.
It was critically acclaimed and it won some awards and it was read. It wasn't like it wasn't doing okay. It did pretty well, but yeah, it seems like it didn't become mainstream until the film came
The
out.
status that it has now is like
Yeah.
almost untouchable. Like you said, it's like sort of compared to things like Lord of the Rings.
Right.
It's unfortunate that he didn't see a lot of that success and that huge wave.
So before he died, he also wrote a very positive review of Terry Brooks's The Sword of Shannara book, and apparently this was kind of a big springboard for Terry Brooks as an author, and he sort of launched his career in the way that like really well-known authors positively reviewing other authors can sometimes do. And Terry Brooks is an author I have not read, but I am very familiar with. I know that he has very prolific, and he wrote a lot of those Shannara books, and it also got an adaptation. So just interesting to see the effects, right, and the lineage of different authors and how they connect to one another in the genre. And then, of course, this is just a massive series that is incredibly influential just across. I mean, we talk about Game of Thrones and Song of Ice and Fire because that's like something we've both read, but I'm sure if you're more well-read in both sci-fi and fantasy, you could probably tie it to dozens of other series, right? Like it's everywhere.
Oh, I'm sure. Absolutely, yeah. And a lot of the time, like I think we try to tie it to things we've covered on the podcast
Right.
too. But yeah, I'm sure that there's plenty of these. I'm sure that it spreads very wide. The shadow looms large in the sci-fi community.
Which is why it's so cool that we're getting to cover this now. Like I don't know, man. It's like we've had a few of these moments this year, you know, like covering Margaret Atwood or covering Agatha Christie, where it's like big names that I've always heard, but I didn't have the direct experience of reading and covering their work. So I'm just really enjoying finally getting to read Frank Herbert, know what all the fuss is about, and feel like I can now participate in this conversation.
Definitely. I mean, this is like I mentioned in our 200th episode when we were talking about this being our next project. This is something that's been on the horizon literally our entire podcast, seemingly.
Seems like
it was
man.
like Blade Runner 2049 came out early on in the podcast, and then basically after that we knew that Dune was going to be Denis Villeneuve's next project.
Yeah.
And then, you know, over the what, 4 years now, it's been just like people nonstop telling me that like if I can't believe you haven't read Dune and everything. So now that we finally get to cover it, it's just like a dream. It feels like Christmas, you know, for us to be able to cover something like this.
So exciting. All right. So I'm going to read. I have the plot divided into two hefty chunks. I'm going to read the first one now. So if you truly want to avoid all spoilers, I guess check out now. Just know that we're enjoying it. And if you're waiting for us to sign off on it, I'm going to go ahead and say I'm signing off on this thing. I think it's well worth reading.
Agreed.
Okay. I'm going to probably butcher some of these fictional names. I have heard the audiobook version, but I have never tried to say them myself. So we'll see how they come out. Also, you know, they're a little odd, some of them, so bear with me. So Duke Leto Atreides of House Atreides, ruler of the ocean planet Caladan, is assigned by the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV to serve as a fief ruler of the planet Arrakis. Although Arrakis is a harsh and inhospitable desert planet, it is of enormous importance because it is the only planetary source of melange, or spice, a priceless and exclusive substance that extends human youth, vitality, and lifespan, the official reason for its high demand in the Empire. More significantly, it is through the consumption of spice that the guild navigators are able to obtain their extraordinary mental capabilities. Shaddam sees House Atreides as a potential future rival and threat, and conspires with House Harkonnen, currently in charge of spice harvesting on Arrakis and long-standing enemies of House Atreides, to destroy Leto and his family after their arrival. Leto is aware his assignment is a trap of some kind, but cannot refuse. Leto's concubine, Lady Jessica, is an acolyte of the Bene Gesserit, a exclusively female group that pursues mysterious political aims and wields seemingly superhuman physical and mental abilities. Though Jessica was instructed by the Bene Gesserit to bear a daughter as part of their breeding program, out of love for Leto, she bore a son, Paul. From a young age, Paul has been trained in warfare by Leto's aides, the elite soldiers Duncan Idaho and Gurney Halleck, and the Mentat Thufir Hawat has prepared him for becoming a cunning political maneuverer. Jessica has also trained Paul in what Bene Gesserit discipline she can. His prophetic dreams interest Jessica's superior, the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohaim. She subjects Paul to the Gom Jabbar, a deadly test which causes blinding pain as part of an assessment of the subject's humanity. To her surprise, Paul manages to pass despite being exposed to more pain than any others before him. Okay, so let's stop there. We just piled a bunch of names onto you.
Yeah, as Frank Herbert did.
Yeah. It's a lot. So let's just react to a lot of these characters. Let's back up. Where do we start in this book? I guess, where do you want to start?
Yeah, I do want to jump in real quick and say, with all these characters, I think Herbert did something really smart, which was although it's kind of Paul's story, he jumps into other characters' point of views.
Yes.
Sort of on a whim.
Yeah.
Like out of nowhere.
These days, you would call that head hopping. It was much more the style of the time. We've seen it in some of the like Stephen King books we've read and some of the older books we've read. Certain authors do it very well. I think Herbert does it well here, to where you're not confused about whose thoughts you're getting, which is often the danger.
No, yeah, it's clear, but it's also like it's just the shift is so sudden sometimes.
It's kind of surprising, right? Yeah, well, we're not these days. You just don't see it as much.
Yeah, but I think it is effective because there's so many characters, and we get this sort of the story's told in an interesting way too, because there is like an epistolary nature to it. We're not surprised by a lot of the events so far that we've gotten. We've sort of had like prophecies giving them to us, or there's like these little forewords at the beginning of each chapter.
Yeah, so you're talking about these epigraphs that appear at the start of each chapter, which is really fascinating, because this is the kind of stuff. There's certain things in this novel that I was seeing and I'm going like, there's an urge to do this in novels that people write today. I've had the urge to do this sort of stuff. It's being done well here, but one of the things that these epigraphs do is they provide a certain context for what's going to happen. They sometimes foreshadow big events. Like they mention the death of the Duke well before the Duke ever happens, right? Or before that ever happens. Like they mention the traitor and this doctor before we even really know much about him. So there's a lot of this interesting foreshadowing, but then it's also providing just like texture to the world. You get like songs, you get stuff, but then it's also it's like some point in the future, looking back at these times in which now it's almost legendary, which makes it feel like we're getting very big, important, universe-altering things happening, and it's being told as if it's like legend. And I don't know, I think that's really cool. It's like we're getting the real story of what is now legend. It's kind of the feel that you get from it, and I love that. Yeah,
definitely. So to tie that back to what we were talking about with all these characters, I think that jumping into somebody else's head, getting their motivation, gives us as the reader obviously their motivation and what they're planning on doing. And in some ways it's spoiling things for us along the way, but it keeps you understanding what's happening. And I appreciated that, especially early on, like with all these characters to introduce. And it's not taking away, it's not like, it doesn't feel like spoilers to me, because like it adds tension to certain scenes because you don't know how exactly they're going to portray them.
Yeah, he's deliberately doing it in the way that foreshadowing, when done well, can actually be an enticement to continue, right? Like it creates a curiosity gap where you're like, well, how does this go down? And you want to find out how things happen, even though you kind of know certain, you could call them spoilers for the plot, but it's given to you directly and deliberately, so it's not really a spoiler because that's the way the author wants you to find this information.
Yeah.
I will be really curious to see in the film if they do any of this or if they play it more. I assume they won't. I think they
probably won't.
Yeah,
I don't think they will quite as much,
but
but
do in film.
I'll also be interested to see if Herbert continues to do it quite as much as he did in this early part here, because I think this was the establishing first book here. As like,
I think we're going to get it throughout the entire book. That's just
You do?
Yeah, I don't think it'll drop.
Okay.
But we'll see how it goes.
I just don't know if he'll be like as heavy-handed with the details that he's giving before chapters and things like that.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, so let's talk about the Atreides house, right? We get the father, Leto, we get Paul, and we get Lady Jessica, who is not actually his wife, the Duke's wife.
Well, at the end of this, we also
is a
figure out what
concubine.
her house actually is. Yeah.
Yeah, and she's a Bene Gesserit. And yeah, we find out some more about her parentage, which we'll get into in part 2, maybe. So let's hold off on that. So just early introductions to these characters. Yeah, you have this like old woman come in with a mysterious box, and then Paul puts his hand into it, and it starts, torturing him essentially. And he's being tested, and he doesn't have to pull his hand out. And this is when I realized like a big part of this book is going to be psychological. We get this sort of litany against fear. This is when it first appears. And I got the sense that, with the Mentats and the Bene Gesserit, and a lot of their powers seem caught up in their ability to read people, and they have this sight where they can tell very minute things and suss out hidden meaning. And you're in a setting where you're looking at people trying to decide whether or not they've betrayed you and they're actually, working for somebody else. It's really fascinating, and I liked that it was sort of taking something that we can all do to an extent and cranking it up to a level where it almost feels supernatural. Like they're just really perceptive. But what results from that I love is all those sections that are sort of from their point of view. It's like Paul's point of view, Jessica's point of view, and even to a lesser extent, the Duke's point of view. You're having really perceptive characters who seem very intelligent and who are aware that they're in danger, still getting caught up in a web, right? And it feels very well plotted and well written for me to buy everything that happens, even when you've so thoroughly established that these characters are extremely clever and perceptive to where they don't actually see it coming. So it's very well executed, and I love all that stuff going on here early.
Yeah, and so I wanted to jump back to the box really quickly, just because you reminded me, you asked me early on about the fear thing, and you just sort of triggered something that I wanted to talk about. And this is the idea that the Reverend Mother who shows up starts asking, and so does Jessica to an extent, about like whether Paul is a human or an animal.
Yeah.
And then that goes, and then they start to sort of explain a little bit in this idea about animal instinct, and like an animal has fear and can't it has to act on that instinct, and then humans have this capability to address that fear, think about it, and then push past it and deal with that regardless of that. So I think that quote's probably speaking about that in a sense, as well as like this higher form of being that can decide to face these fears or face the and like the mind killer, fear being the mind killer.
She says like an animal would chew its own arm off to escape the trap, whereas a human might feign unconsciousness and instead wait for the captor to come in and kill them or something. So
right.
I don't know if that's all necessarily true, but that's what's being proposed here.
I like it for the story. Yeah, that's what's being given to us.
It's interesting.
And then I really the family here, I mean, like they're very charismatic as well. Like you can tell that people want to follow them, they respect them, they gain favor quickly with people.
Leto really favors people over land and over power. It seems like he's a nice guy. And he's like, he's honorable, and I don't know about you, man, but I was getting strong Stark vibes.
Stark vibes, yeah, of course. Yeah.
I really think this book may have been very influential for Martin.
Yeah. And with Paul, I was getting very strong, like, maybe not quite specifically Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, but like, how could you not, right? It's not that he's a farmer boy, but this like chosen one.
He's got a very different vibe than Luke Skywalker does, though, because Luke Skywalker's got a very boyish kind of having fun. Like he's got these powers that are almost psychic, obviously with the Force, but Paul he's very calculating. He reads people. He can perceive things that he shouldn't be able to perceive. He doesn't seem very sort of happy-go-lucky ever. In fact, he strikes me as being very serious most of the time, which I guess makes him a distinct character in that sense. Like he's very interesting as a character, and I'm enjoying learning about him. Yeah,
in the same way that Luke sort of grows his skill and then over time grows his mind. This character seems to be doing something very similar, where along the way they're losing that sense of innocence, and also like the main thing that I wanted to say is that like I think everybody can reading this book can immediately say like that's an every person kind of like you can see yourself in that character.
Yeah, I think that's the hope, at least.
Relatable.
Relatable. That was the goal. There are some classic tropes of fantasy, fantasy and sci-fi, and I guess any sort of storytelling like this that are, viewed as problematic these days for good reason. One of them that I do want to touch on here, personally, it didn't mess up my ability to enjoy the story, but the Baron Harkonnen is very tropey. He is obese. He is implied to be homosexual, and he is quite obviously the most villainous character we've met so far. He's also sort of described as being kind of weak. So you're getting a lot of these things coming together that are very tropey ways to describe a villain that doesn't, it's like if you don't sort of line up with the classic alpha masculine, heteronormative type of character, then you're villainous, right? Like you're more likely to be a bad person. And so obviously I don't agree with this. And I don't even know that Frank Herbert was doing it deliberately. Some of this shit, like, we're all prisons of the time we live in, and our sort of the people we're around and the way we're raised, and there's all these different factors. So maybe I'm being too generous here, but it does seem to me like it could just happen accidentally. He could not even really be thinking about what he was sort of saying by making these sort of choices. It's just like he just kind of went with it, and then who knows how he felt about it years later, because I'm sure once it blew up, he probably heard about it. But at the time, did he even realize he was doing it, or was it more just like something that he just came out without him meaning, like almost accidental? I don't know. It's weird to say accidental, because everything that people put in books is deliberate, but that part of it he might not have fully thought through, or maybe he doesn't care and he actually finds homosexual people to be evil. I don't know the man, and I don't know what his politics were and so forth, but I want to give him the benefit of the doubt, I guess. But maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. I'll be curious to read more about him.
It's a time period thing, I would say, as well. And like, that's not, I don't think you can necessarily be forgiven for that, but I also think that it's like a product of the time. Yeah. And like, almost any story we read in this time period written by a white guy is going to have this kind of stuff in it. Yeah. And it's like, it just goes to show like how fucked up society's been for such a long time.
Well, and clearly we're getting into some tricky white savior territories, perhaps, with him being this messiah coming to these other people, the Fremen, who, are the natives, and maybe he's going to be a messiah for them. That seems kind of tricky. Anyway, I'm sure we'll talk about that more as we actually explore more of the book itself and what actually happens.
Let's talk more about the Baron, though. Like, what did you think about the Baron as far as like his plan and everything?
I think he's a great villain. And one of the other things I wanted to say about that is that like sometimes when I would initially hear that, there's certain way, like when I'm exposed to certain ideas as being problematic, there are like waves of like my initial reaction and then like my reaction after I've thought about it over time, and like some of my initial tendency was to push back about that. It's like, oh, well, why can't the villain be someone who's obese or gay or whatever? And the argument is not that they cannot be that. It's like a historical context thing. It's like if you look on the whole of the genre, more often than not, or more frequently than you would imagine, you start to see this coming up, and it's more about like trends in greater genre going on, which is kind of tough because you have to be kind of well read and be thinking about this sort of thing to even notice it. So in isolation, it can feel like you're nitpicking and being kind of weird by even highlighting it. But when taken as a greater context of the whole, I think it's worth noting. But that's, all of that's to say that in isolation, I actually find this character to be really interesting and intimidating as a villain. He is repeatedly described as gross, which is someone who's overweight myself. Like, I don't love it. I don't love the sort of equating physical, your physical attributes and not being, sort of classically attractive to being a bad person. But even with that, I still kind of like the character just because he's very interesting, and he's a shithead, and I don't know, man. I find myself still being taken with the character in the way that a good villain can be written, even if I sort of bristle at some of the stuff.
Yeah. Well, like you said too, is very confident in his
Yeah.
plan, confident in like the fact that he knows like no matter what goes on, like he's crafted this masterful ruse that's going to trick everyone and there's no way it can go wrong, and intimidating, like you said, seems powerful, seems like somebody who at least at this part that is kind of unquestioned in their authority.
Yeah.
But I feel like we brushed over a character that's really important, which is Jessica.
Yeah.
And like
Which, by the way, before we talk about Jessica, it's kind of odd to me. I mean, we get the same with Paul, but like Jessica, for whatever reason, stands out to me more. Kind of odd to have a character whose name is just like Jessica. When you have like some really,
I thought about that
like
as well.
Leto and like, you know, he's like very almost exotic sounding names that are, you know, very futuristic sounding. And then you have Paul and Jessica. And I wonder why he did that. I wonder if he wanted to make them feel more familiar to us, if that actually gives us a touchstone and makes them feel like someone we could know in real life because they have a more familiar name.
Well, I want to talk about Jessica, but there's another name that I think we should talk about after this, and that's Duncan Idaho. Was the name that really threw me for a loop? I was like, whoa, that's an interesting choice for a name there.
Yeah.
But yeah, Jessica, I love the way that she's sort of, first of all, I love that she like chose to have Paul over this religion. I love like pushing back against that and showing like how she's clearly a big believer in it and has powers and everything and knows that it's real, but push back against it. And then sort of the way that she dealt with the scene where Paul's putting his hand in the square, she knew it had to go down the way that it did.
Gamjaba.
She had to deal with that. And I don't know, I like her as a mother, but I also like her as like a character who is like shown to be pretty formidable, and I'm going to be interested to see her role in the story going forward, because where we're at currently, you know, she's experienced and she's the most experienced between herself and Paul, and yet like there's some weird like power dynamics that are going on right now in their relationship.
Yeah, totally agree. And she is a fascinating character. She's like one of the most insightful characters. I mean, Paul is also, but in kind of a slightly different way. But her sort of Bene Gesserit ability to read the truth from people, it's really fascinating. Like, I love the whole, like, we're about to get into the part where she learns of the suspicion that has been placed on her as being a potential traitor, and the way she sort of susses it all out and combats it. I don't know. It's just really cool. Definitely love reading her sections.
Let's talk about Duncan Idaho though, and Thurfer and Gurney kind of as a unit.
Yeah.
Because they're all sort of like
Leto's aides. Yeah. Gurney Halleck, man, what a cool character. He's like the personal trainer of Paul in like combat. He's always kind of ready with a joke, but then he's always doing all these quotes, which are fascinating, right? And
he like sings and stuff too, and he like breaks out. I love that.
Very cool. And this has got to be it's got to be Jason Momoa in the new movie, right? Like that. I'm pretty sure that's him. That's Gurney.
You know, I don't know for sure.
If that is him, very cool casting. Just I think very neat. Yeah, and then you have this Mentat and Hoat, who's got this theory about Lady Jessica maybe being the traitor. And it's interesting that they're all blind to this doctor. As the real traitor. It seems like Yui or something. And everyone thinks he can't possibly be the traitor because of how much he hates the Harkonnens and that like his wife was killed by them in the past. So it's really cleverly set up. We learn that maybe she's not dead, the wife, and she's actually a prisoner and being tortured, and so he's trying to sort of free her, even though he knows that he's likely to be double-crossed by the Harkonnens. So there's all these layers of double crossing going on, and even the traitor himself does some things that we kind of like he helps save Paul and Lady Jessica, even though he kind of set up the whole situation anyway. So it's like, how much can you forgive him? And then he uses the Duke to try and kill the Baron, which we should probably maybe we should read the second part as we're getting into further details, but
I do want to share up a couple of things real quick. I looked it up. Jason Momoa plays Duncan Idaho, actually.
Okay, interesting.
And Josh Brolin plays Gurney.
Josh Brolin's Gurney? I thought Josh Brolin was the Duke. He's not the Duke?
No, Oscar Isaac.
Oh, Oscar Isaac's the Duke. Wow, man. I clearly didn't know exactly who's who in this group. Interesting. Yeah, I'd be very curious to see these portrayals. Are you? I think I want to just read the second chunk here, and then we can just kind of talk more openly about everything that's going on.
Yeah, because I think we're going to get more about like Thurfer, Hawat, and Gurney, and Duncan, and everybody in this summary, and we can kind of just react to everything.
Okay. So Leto, Jessica, and Paul travel to their household to occupy Arrakeen, the stronghold on Arrakis, formerly held by House Harkonnen. Leto learns of the dangers involved in harvesting the spice, which is protected by giant sandworms, and negotiates with the planet's native Fremen, seeing them as a valuable ally rather than foes. Soon after Atreides' arrival, Harkonnen forces attack, joined by the Emperor's ferocious Sardaukar troops in disguise. Leto is betrayed by his personal physician, the Suk Doctor Wellington Yueh, who delivers a drugged Leto to Baron Vladimir Harkonnen and his twisted mentat, Peter de Vries. Yueh, however, arranges for Jessica and Paul to escape into the desert, where they are presumed dead by the Harkonnens. Yueh replaces one of Leto's teeth with a poison gas capsule, hoping Leto can kill the Baron during their encounter. Yueh is murdered by de Vries upon delivering Leto, while the Baron narrowly avoids the gas, which instead kills Leto and de Vries. After fleeing into the desert, Paul realizes he has significant powers as a result of the Bene Gesserit breeding scheme, inadvertently caused by Jessica bearing a son and his exposure to high concentrations of spice. In visions, he foresees futures in which he will live among the planet's native Fremen, and is also informed of the addictive qualities of the spice. It is revealed that Jessica is the daughter of Baron Harkonnen, a secret kept from her by the Bene Gesserit. Okay, so that's the last big bombshell we get there at the end. Jessica's the daughter of the Baron Harkonnen.
Which means that Paul is also related to the Baron Harkonnen.
Right, yeah. That's his, like, grandfather, I guess. So he's also Harkonnen. Yeah, wow. So, again, reminds me of Game of Thrones, right? Like, these inner family politics and stuff. Very, very interesting.
I wanted to take a second, too, to just talk about, like, how, there's a lot that we just went through, but so much time is taken in this novel to, like, really flesh out the world. And when we go to, like, the sand... to the spice mining, there's, like, a lot that's given.
So cool. They're flying in this, like, thopter...
Yeah. Oh my god, so cool.
Yeah, they the Duke is the one who spots the worm, like it's like a worm sign, it's called, and he spots the worm sign and he calls it in, and then there's this whole thing where, like, whoever spots the worm sign gets, like, extra credits or something, it's extra money for doing it, and he, like, awards it to the people who are working there rather than himself.
Well, and then the attack happens, and he gets all of the people out, which is very important to show his character.
Yeah, he then saves them. Yeah, and then it shows the strength of the worm as it's, like, swallowing them. It's also said, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like if you don't kill, like, every section of a worm, it'll just, like, regrow.
Yeah, I think it said it was, like, some sort of, like, electrostatic, like, thing that goes all the way down that kills it all at the same time, because otherwise, if you blow up or burn or shoot one portion, it'll sort of just fall off and the segment will continue. The rest will continue living.
Man, it's fascinating. These are
so
some
cool.
wild creatures, and they're incredibly huge.
But even things like the dinner party that happens when there's, like, the banker that's there, and the way that, like, Paul's interacting with the banker, and, like, just the political vying that's going on there, into just the attack happened so quickly too. It kind of crept up on me within the story when basically the Duke is, like, backstabbed by Yueh.
I mean, and I don't know about you, but I was feeling a lot of affection for the Duke. Like, I think he does a great job of making us like him. He seems like a good dude. He seems honorable. And it's like, this guy's going to die. And sure enough, he does. It's also been foreshadowed, so we know he's going to die, which creates, like, it's a very tragic. He's a tragic figure because you know he's going to die, and you're learning about how good of a person he seems to be, and you're like, well, he's not long for this world. And then sure enough, he does, yeah.
So I love the explanation of, like, moisture and everything as well, too. Like, the suits that
still
are talked about, the way that they, like, recycle. The still suits recycle the water for you and keep a lot of the moisture in. And the way that they respect, like, moisture, and, like, obviously the nobles seem to have been abusing the system and using up all the water.
The Harkonnens had this whole thing where you show up at their house and they, like, pour water on the ground or something, and, like, into these puddles, and then, like, people would come and just sop it up. And it was all just, like, the waste. The cruelty was the point, you know what I mean? And the way that the Harkonnens ruled, and that sounds familiar to me in our political climate.
I love that the Fremen, like, have evolved to the point that, like, they get a slash and, like, it immediately, like, cauterizes itself almost. And, like, seals up. And, like, the spit, you remember I think it's Stilgar or someone like that like spits as a form of affection to show like I'm willing to give you my moisture or something.
Yeah, it's former respect. Yeah.
I thought that was awesome too, like cool world building, this idea, because it makes sense. And I also love the detail that the Atreides come from this like water planet, and so they like have so much water, and then these people, the people from Arrakis, see them as like soft water people, and they haven't had to deal with the hardship of not having a lot of water on their planet and stuff.
Well, you imagine everybody's like dehydrated down there. Probably.
Yeah. Kynes wants to like terraform or do something to like switch the habitat of the planet to create this lush environment and everything. Like just so much going on, and so
and there's like an implication that he knows about some secret store of water or some reason why there's not more water, and maybe there could be a way to fix it. I don't think we got that. We don't have like the truth behind that revealed yet, but yeah, lots of characters seem to have these secrets, which just makes it all more fascinating. So I didn't know whether or not this gambit was going to work by the Duke, right? Like this gas tooth. And it's Yui's gambit, I guess, and that he's trying to take out Baron Harkonnen with the Duke. And so he's staged this thing that comes close to working but doesn't work. And I guess it makes sense because like ultimately he is a hated figure, right? Like he is the betrayer and the traitor. So even though he tried in his own way to like at least take out Baron Harkonnen too, it doesn't end up working. So
he does do something that I like with the ring though. He like takes the ring and says like I'm gonna get this to Paul and he'll rule, and like the as he should and that kind of thing. So I think if, like you said, doing the wrong thing but having sort of some of he has his own motivations, obviously. Like he doesn't align with our main characters, but it's like he sort of seems like he had some humanity to him where he kind of understood what was going on and wanted to do some of the right things. I don't know.
He's really interesting. He's much more interesting than he would be if he was just a straight up traitor who you just hated because his reasons were like greed. It's like no, he's trying to save his wife. He like loves the people that he's betraying, so it's tragic, and also he knows what his like how they're going to think of him historically, and we see examples of that in those epigraphs, right, where like he's known as the traitor and there's like little rhymes about him being a traitor, and that's like his legacy. So he's kind of tragic in his own way, and in that way. Yeah, really fascinating. And then I was really surprised that Peter DeVries, this Mentat assassin, who was a really cool, like, scary character, I was surprised he was the one who ended up dying from the gas. Ends up taking him out. I don't know. Fascinating. This book has had some surprises for me.
Yeah, very cool character. And we get a good glimpse of a Mentat from him early on, and then sort of can understand what Paul is and how he's sort of like secretly been trained as a Mentat almost. Like he doesn't realize it along the way, but has sort of Mentat training. And it's basically like very logical, on emotion. They can do things without emotion and like sort of see through problems in that way. But then he also has the training like we've talked about with the Bene Gesserit, and he has this like mystical sort of like attachment to
ability to foresee the future, seems like.
Yeah. And so like having those two balances, and then also that leads us to sort of some of the end stuff that we get where he's realizing that the spice is affecting him and has this like crazy trip, this crazy like vision, and all these things are given to us so quickly. And I guarantee this is one of the most important sections in the book because it's we're seeing like, doesn't he like see his grandfather or something, and like he's seeing the future, he's seeing all these different timelines and possibilities. And
you're making me want to go back and reread that section just because you're right. It probably is really important. Prophecies. Right?
And then he comes out of that and he's talking to Jessica and telling her all of these things that like he tells her that she's pregnant.
Yeah.
He, which she just barely knew, and
I forgot to that wasn't in this like summary, but yeah, that's another bombshell is that she's pregnant currently, and no one knew about it, not even the Duke.
Lady Jessica knew about it because of her Bene Gesserit abilities, and that's like the only reason. So yeah, I'm interested because we've talked many times about these stories where characters get insanely powerful, and how that can affect the story, and how difficult that can be to juggle as a writer. And so I'll be interested to see like how Paul is handled throughout, because he seemed in that moment to be extremely powerful and like able to predict everything and knew all of these details. Like, remember she asks him like, should we go to the Fremen? Should we trust the Fremen? And he knows, he's like, yes, we should. That's what we're supposed to do. And
yeah, how do you deal with a character who can see the future? That is an
Right.
open. Yeah, that's a tough ask in a book, and I will be very curious to see how Herbert handles it. I think we've done a pretty good job setting up all the different characters and sort of where they're at the end here. It's an exciting first book. It's basically all about the assassination of the Duke and the collapse of the House Atreides. Now they're on the run. Harkonnen has sort of retaken power here. I like it. I think that's a really cool way to end this section. It makes sense. Do we want to get into some predictions, or are we worried we might touch on knowledge from the old movie? Because I truthfully don't remember anything about it.
I really don't either. Yeah. So I mean, we can talk about it some.
I will admit one thing I do remember. I think at some point, Paul rides a worm or controls a worm. He either rides it or controls it. So that is about as much as I can remember. So you know what I mean? Like, take that for what it is. So beyond that, I make some predictions here about the next section we're gonna read.
Right.
What do you got?
So I mean, obviously he's had this vision of this person who is very important that we've seen as Zendaya in the trailer also. So that's obvious. They're going to the Fremen.
Seems like this Fremen character. Have we met her? Have we met this character yet?
No,
Okay.
but I believe it's the one that he had the vision of, who called him like Uru something. It's a short 4-letter word. I can't think of it right now. But I obviously think that they're gonna go and become like ingratiated with the native people and like sort of learn their ways and like hide with them, become like a part of their. I'm sure that there'll be some moment where Paul does something to save them or help them in some major way where they see him as this Messiah, obviously, which he's predicted in this section already.
Yeah. That's not going to happen for a while, though. It's going to be a lot of him being an outsider and having to win them over, I think, at first. And I also think you touched on this revelation about them being Harkonnens and his mother, and I'm really curious to see where that goes. Like, does that change anything for anybody in the way they feel about the Harkonnens? Or does that just make them hate them even more? Hate this Baron? I don't know. I'm very fascinated.
Oh my God. Well, you keep bringing up things from the vision. That vision, he literally talks about how like all these warring factions, and he keeps thinking about all this stuff, and he's seeing it from like a bird's eye perspective and seeing all of the inner workings of all of these people. And yet he thinks of his dad being dead and having been killed, and he like comes back down to the ground level more and thinks about how like they're all people, they're all just trying to survive, and this sort of like kumbaya thing that he's feeling, but at the same time is like, but they killed my dad. And
that was when he was he allowed himself to mourn for the first time too, and he actually got teared up about it. So that's interesting, right? Because it's if you can see the future, you do kind of become a character who is somehow above like regular human emotion. But the idea that he then comes back down and is grounded, I don't know, it's interesting, right? Like it I'm sure it's something that they'll explore further as we continue to go.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you have any other? I think we're going to get more of the world itself. Like, we're down on the dunes now, right? We're going to get Arrakis. We're going to learn about the Fremen. I think this is going to be a lot of Fremen. We're going to learn about these prophecies, what exactly they mean. Moad'Dib, right? Like, it's what they call them.
Let's talk about that also really quickly, though, too. That was super fascinating. The Bene Gesserit, like, overarching power has sort of sent these prophecies out to all these planets and all these places that are maybe not as developed as their places, so that if these Bene Gesserit people are ever stranded, they can sort of use these prophecies to say like, maybe I'm important and powerful, you should treat me as such, and then they immediately have status, they immediately have like protection in these worlds. And that's so interesting to think about, because we're dealing with an area where it seems like they've almost like fabricated prophecies and sent them out everywhere, but at the same time, like, they're going to start coming true. Like, a lot of these prophecies are clearly going to be correct. So the religion is real in that way and correct. We've seen the power that they have, so it's obviously real.
Right. Yeah. It's very fascinating, right? Like, if you orchestrate the arrival of a Messiah, and then it happens because you orchestrated it, but yet the people believe it as a religion, like, it still holds the cultural power of a real Messiah at a certain point, right? And especially if you're talking about a situation where people have almost magical powers, which they seem to almost have.
It's like self-realizing prophecy stuff, right? Like you're sending it out, and it so happens to come true, but so it seems like it was all along planned that way. I don't know. It's going to be really fascinating, and I'm so taken with this whole journey so far.
Okay, well, I think this is a good part to leave our first book here, and we will next week be covering Book 2, Moad'Dib, where we'll get the middle chunk of Dune. So excited to be on Arrakis and finally talking about this thing. I will be in Florida. I'm leaving tomorrow. I'm going to be in Florida, seeing you and my brother, and trying to be as safe as I can, traveling with COVID and everything. But what's interesting is that we will be recording our next episode in person together for the first time since before the pandemic began. I'm excited about that. Should be kind of a unique episode in that sense, just because we don't normally record, right next to each other. We're
gonna sit like 2 feet from each other, staring directly into each other's eyes, into one microphone, and it's gonna be
very intimate.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting. I feel like we might forget how to podcast because we have to do it in person, right?
Hopefully you join us for that. If you're excited about Dune as a project and us finally getting to it, let us know in the form of a rating and review. Let us know what you thought of this first episode and what you think of the podcast in general. We'd love hearing that kind of feedback, and especially it helps get the word out for other listeners.
And make sure to follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film.
Oh, speaking of, in case you missed our 200th episode, we just opened up our Discord to non-Patreon subscribers. So anybody can join now. You just need to either be in the Council of Inklings, which is our Facebook group where I posted the link in there, or you can just reach out via direct message to any of our social media platforms, and I will send you the link. And that's just to make sure that the people who are in there are people who actually want to be in there. But yeah, if you do that, we're having fun on there, chatting with some of our listeners. I'd like to continue to grow it some more, so we'd love to have you on our Discord. Just let me know that you are interested, and I will send you a link.
If you'd like to support the podcast in another way, check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/Ink2Film. And we put out bonus episodes monthly. We're about to record another one, for October eventually. Yeah. And it's going to be Dune. We're going to do the 80s version of Dune. So look forward to that. And just for $2 a month, you get those bonus episodes. We have like 40 of them. So check that out.
We also just put out an extended version of the game we played in our 200th episode, where we're guessing first lines from books and lines from the movies that we've covered, that sort of stuff. So it was a fun kind of a continuation of the game. So if that sounds interesting to you, also you're going to want to go on to Patreon to listen to that. And we wanted to thank Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
I cannot wait to continue reading. I'm going to continue reading tonight. And next time we record, we'll be together. Yeah. So looking forward to that.
Yeah, I will be on Arrakis while I am flying over the country tomorrow, spending my days, spending my time in Arrakis, riding sandworms, all the good stuff. And until next time,
keep adapting.